Welcome to Now Let's Talk, the podcast with Vanessa Corwin and Kathleen Kahn, where we speak with our guests about the joys and challenges of life in today's world. Hello, I'm Vanessa Corwin.
And I'm Kathleen Kahn.
We're officially into the Trump presidency, and U.S. and allied support for Ukraine is in jeopardy. The war in Gaza and the U.S. elections have dominated the news cycles. To provide an update, Professor Alexander Motyl, Ukraine and Russia expert at Rutgers University, joins us today. Welcome, Alex. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
So on January 9th, the Biden administration announced its last military aid package for Ukraine, which includes a presidential drawdown authority package estimated at $500 million. And this will provide Ukraine with capabilities such as missiles for air defense, air-to-ground munitions, and equipment to support Ukraine's use of the F-16s. So what does this mean for Ukraine? And can the Trump administration kill this package?
Well, it's welcome. Any assistance is always welcome, but it's unfortunately somewhat typical of the Biden administration. Too little, too late. Biden waits until the waning moments of his presidency to up the ante and provide a little more assistance. This should have been done months, if not years ago. That said, better late than never. As to President Trump, I mean, the fear was that he was going to cut off aid. Based on his rhetoric during the campaign, it looked like he had no sympathy for Ukraine whatsoever, and he held a very derogatory attitude towards President Zelensky. But since the election, remarkably enough, he, as well as a number of his advisors, have made a number of comments that suggest that they've gotten religion. So Trump recently criticized Putin. He accused him of destroying Russia. And he said explicitly that Zelensky wants a peace deal, Putin doesn't, and that unless Putin changes his mind, he's going to be imposing significant sanctions as well as tariffs on all possible Russian products. That suggests, for what it's worth, that Trump's attitude toward Ukraine and Russia and to the potential for peace negotiations may have changed. The question is, will this stay as is, or will he change his mind once again? As you know, he's mercurial, he's unpredictable, and it's conceivable that he might. That said, there is ground for optimism, at least from the Ukrainian point of view, because this is the first time that Trump and his colleagues have openly, expressly said that they effectively think Russia should be defeated and Ukraine should gain some kind of victory in order for peace negotiations to take place. That's a big step forward, and it will commit Trump to some degree. He can always change his mind, but if he changes his mind in 3 days, he begins to look like a flake. That doesn't help his image. So at least for the foreseeable future, this is likely to be something resembling a policy attitude, if not indeed a concrete policy.
As you say, Trump is very mercurial. So could he kill this package if he so decides?
Oh, of course, he could easily kill it. But at this point, it looks unlikely that that'll be the case. But as I said, we don't know because it's Trump.
Now tell me, Alex, what is the Ukraine Defense Contact Group? Who are the members and what is their function? And will they continue to get together with this administration?
Well, the last question is the big one. But this was a group that was established a few years ago in Ramstein, Germany, and it incorporates something like 50 to 60 countries that have committed to supplying Ukraine with financial and weapons assistance. And the point of the group is to determine what Ukraine needs, who supplies it, to coordinate, in other words. And it's been useful. It's not exactly a game changer, but it's been useful. Any kind of outside assistance is useful for Ukraine. As to whether Trump will continue acting within it, possibly yes, in the sense that it's an opportunity for him to grandstand and to insist that Europeans carry a bigger burden. Possibly no, in as much as he has his own plans as to how to end the war. And that particular group doesn't seem to play any kind of role in those plans. But since we don't know exactly what the plans are, who knows?
Well, Biden was supposed to attend a meeting of this group, but had to cancel because of the California fires. Do you think that impacts the situation at all?
On the group?
Yeah.
Well, it's always good to have a president present because it gives more oomph to his appearance or her appearance. But I don't think it made much of a difference in terms of the deliberations or the raison d'etre of the group.
Speaking of solutions, Trump's incoming envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, told Fox News that he hopes to have and I quote, solvable solution between the two sides within Trump's first 100 days. Do you see this happening? And if so, what would that solution look like?
Well, it's better than Trump's original claim that he would solve the problem in 24 hours. So 100 days is over 3 months.
Not about that.
Yeah.
That's at least much more realistic. It's conceivable. It's conceivable. It all depends on what Trump decides to do. The war could easily have been ended at any time in the last 3 years if the West in general and the United States in particular had really provided Ukraine with the military hardware it needed to prevail. And Biden was always a little wishy-washy. He wasn't sure he wanted Ukraine to win, but he didn't want Russia to lose. Well, if Trump decides that he's willing to let Russia lose and ramps up the assistance to Ukraine, while at the same time imposing tariffs and sanctions, more tariffs and more sanctions on Russia, then it's conceivable that Russia will be pressed against the wall and might cry uncle. One of the reasons why it's possible is that, well, two reasons. One is that the situation on the front is actually going very badly for the Russians. They're losing about 1,500 soldiers a day. They've already lost over 800,000. And there's just no way that you can interpret that as being a victorious war. At the same time, in terms of the territory that the Russians have grabbed over the last half years, it's roughly equivalent to Long Island, which on the one hand is, a lot, I guess, but compared to the size of Ukraine, it's about half a percentage point, which is not a lot. And when you consider the costs the Russians are bearing, 800,000 dead and wounded,
Yes.
then you begin to wonder. And then the other point that makes Russia very vulnerable to the potential of sanctions and tariffs is that the Russian economy is very, very weak and headed for catastrophe. It's only recently that Western analysts have discovered that. I've known that for at least half a year, not because I'm smart, but because I've been listening to Russian economists who've been pointing to the statistics, who've been showing television clips of Russian official economists complaining about the condition of the economy. So this has been a known secret for at least 6 months. And it's only now that it's kind of seeping into the discourse here in the West. But when you add all that up, you've got a Russia which is actually far weaker than Putin claims it is. And if Trump, who seems to recognize that because he accused Putin of destroying Russia, if Trump were to decide to really put the pressure on Putin, that could make a big difference.
So, what about these North Korean troops that are bolstering the Russian army? I mean, they have such a population advantage over Ukraine. Are they having trouble recruiting troops for the front? Is that why they had to bring in these North Korean troops?
Well, that's the answer to your question.
Yeah.
2 years ago, they started emptying prisons and offering criminals, I mean, really high level criminals, the opportunity to be pardoned if they went to the front. Most of them, I believe the percentage of them that were killed or seriously wounded was something like 90%. So the Russians have been scraping the bottom of the barrel for a while. And the fact that the North Koreans are now helping out is obviously indicative of Russian weakness. It's clearly not indicative of Russian strength. It would be the equivalent of the United States calling on Canada
Mm.
for assistance in fighting some war. The troops themselves, the numbers vary from somewhere between 10 and
Yeah.
12,000. They appear to have lost about 3 to 4,000 within about a month and a half, which is a very high attrition rate. But that's because they're being used as frontline advances. So the Russians are cleverly exploiting them as
Mm.
cannon fodder. But according to some of the reports I've read, they are apparently well trained and fanatically committed to Kim Il-jung.
Mhm.
So they have a high level of, I guess, morale or ideological persuasion.
And I understand also that Ukraine is having manpower issues as well. Is that right?
That's true too. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is somewhere in the mid to low 40s. And they've appeared to have lost. We don't know for sure. Zelensky, I believe, claims that the number of Ukrainians who've died is about 35,000. That seems very low, but it's conceivable that it's correct. But they are at the point where they need additional soldiers. There's also a problem with desertion. It appears to be centered on only on a number of areas on the front line where the Russians are pressing the hardest. But there are reliable reports that soldiers have deserted.
Hmm.
So there's talk of extending the draft age down to 18. At this point, I believe it's 25 and above.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And there's resistance, partly because these are the boys who are the future of the country. Many of them occupy positions of some importance within the economy. They are the ones who are IT experts.
Yes.
At this point, the Ukrainians are resisting. If the war drags on for more than half a year or a year, they may need to lower the draft age.
With that said, how is the morale among the troops, the Ukrainian troops, and the people of Ukraine?
Well, clearly those soldiers who've deserted or who've refused to sign up after being drafted, and there seem to be a fair number, those are clearly suffering from morale. But based on reports provided by journalists who've been to the front lines, it seems that the soldiers on the front lines still have a high level of morale.
Hmm.
So it's, a little bit of both. But in general, they're still committed. The same is true for the population. The number of people who believe that Ukraine should continue the war until it regains all its territory remains very high. They're determined to pursue the war. They're unwilling to accept a half-hearted peace. So that's still high. It's obviously lower than it was 3 years ago or 2 years ago,
Hmm.
because the wear and tear of the occupation, the impact on infrastructure, the lack of heat
Yeah.
and electricity
Right.
gets people down, of course.
Yeah, you had mentioned a while ago when we spoke to you about the winters in Ukraine to be prepared for that, how difficult that is for the people and the soldiers.
And the soldiers, exactly. I did read a report recently that apparently much of the energy infrastructure, the plants that provide electricity, The Ukrainians have been very adept at quickly repairing them. So the Russians knock it out, and within a few days or weeks, most of it seems to be back online. Again, the person who wrote this is someone I trust, and he's a journalist.
Mhm.
So that seems to suggest that things aren't quite as bad as they were envisioned a year ago.
Hmm.
But one would need to know more about this to be able to say this with complete certainty.
What about the European allies? Are they still strongly supporting Ukraine?
In general, yes. The countries that are weakest on that score are Hungary and Slovakia. Their prime ministers, Mr. Orban and Mr. Fico,
Hmm.
are both supporters of Putin. But the Baltic states, Poland, are very enthusiastic, very supportive. The Finns, the Scandinavians more generally are supportive. The French and the British are supportive. I mean, just recently, Zelensky signed a 100-year pact with Great Britain, a mutual cooperation pact in which the Brits said they would provide Ukraine with a minimum of 3.5 billion. I forget whether it's dollars or pounds a year, but a lot of money plus training and ammunition and so on. So things are okay on that front. Likewise in Germany, where Germany has been very supportive. It's kind of backtracked a bit in recent months, but the person who's likely to win the election that's slated a few weeks from today is very much a strong Ukraine supporter. So it looks like Germany will get back on track as well.
Well, I'm
That's,
glad to hear that about
yeah.
the allies and especially the UK for funding because as we talked about this earlier, but Trump was asked by a reporter, will you cut the funding for Ukraine? He just babbled. He didn't answer.
Yeah.
So that's what scares me. That with
Well,
what Biden has done, he might just say, I'm done. No, we're cutting it.
that's conceivable. It's again with him, you just don't know. And until the statements he made after being elected, I would have said, unfortunately, you're absolutely right. But now he, Rubio,
Yeah.
and the general who's been appointed the intermediary for the war,
Ah.
they've all been making positive noises. They all sound like genuine statesmen as opposed to just fly-by-night policymakers. So at this point, I'm a little hopeful.
Well, this is
Um,
encouraging.
yeah.
A small bright spot there. What about China? How do they fit into this picture?
Well, the Chinese, I mean, apparently they do provide some military assistance in the form of technical parts. And they're clearly on Russia's side. But in effect, now they want Russia to win. They certainly don't want Russia to lose because that would destabilize the entire Eurasian landmass. But they've been very standoffish. When you consider what the North Koreans have done, provided hundreds of thousands of shells, tens of thousands of soldiers, they're potentially promising more soldiers sometime in the summer. And when you consider the size of North Korea and compare it to the size and resources of China, then China has basically been involved in getting a free ride. They've been paying far less. They've been paying lower than market rates for Russian oil and gas.
Hmm.
Again, they're driving a hard bargain. They know that the Russians need to sell. They refuse to deal in rubles. They insist on hard currency. And most recently, after Biden imposed sanctions on Russia's ghost fleet,
Mhm.
this is a series of about 200 tankers that they're kind of semi-registered, semi-unregistered. They're usually old tankers that shouldn't normally be used anymore, but the Russians are using them to bypass the sanctions on oil. Biden imposed sanctions on those tankers. which made them extremely expensive to utilize because insurance companies are now unwilling to provide insurance. And lo and behold, the tankers, like tens or scores of tankers are anchored off the coast of China. The Chinese aren't taking them. They're
Oh,
abiding by the sanctions because they know if they were to violate the sanctions, that would have negative consequences for their relations with the United States. So at the end of the day, they're kind of fair weather friends.
Mhm.
A genuine ally would be doing what North Korea is doing. And instead, the Chinese seem to be enriching themselves at Russia's cost.
do you think that Trump will ask Zelensky to agree to a ceasefire? How do you think Zelensky might respond to that?
And what would that be? What would he
Yeah.
possibly bring forth to Zelensky that he would agree to it?
Well, everybody kind of agrees, both in the Biden camp as well as people in the Trump camp, as well as independent analysts, that if Ukraine were to agree to a ceasefire, well, first of all, simply agreeing to a ceasefire is kind of interesting, but not really very interesting because the really interesting part comes afterwards. Just freezing the contact line, the line of division, doesn't mean that the war is over. Quite the opposite. It can actually enable Russia to lick its wounds and increase its armaments. But whatever the solution is, whether it's a ceasefire, whether Ukraine gets to keep most of the occupied territories, some of the occupied territories, I mean, whatever, there are any number of variants that are possible here. What Ukraine insists on is on being secure. In other words, yeah, peace, sure. Zelensky has even hinted at making territorial concessions, not formally giving away, but just kind of temporarily agreeing that we're not going to try to reconquer these territories militarily. But the key issue is what security guarantees does Ukraine have? And there are basically three answers to that. One is it becomes a member of NATO.
Yeah.
Two is it gets security guarantees along the lines of Israel. And basically, so in other words, basically that means the United States. It could be the Brits and the French, I guess, and possibly the
And the
Germans, but
Germans, yeah.
conceivably, but it would have to be a serious commitment. You
Mm.
wouldn't just say, sure, we'll support you. You really need to be able to put boots in the ground. And finally, uh, building up Ukraine's own capacity to deter a potential second Russian invasion. And of course, those three are complementary. There's no reason why Ukraine couldn't be in NATO, have security guarantees, and of course, ultimately, the most important one would, of course, be its own capacity to defend itself. Because in the final analysis, as nice as NATO is, and as nice as it is to have security guarantees, when push comes to shove, can you really trust
Mm.
your own friend? Maybe yes, maybe no. But you can certainly trust your own armed forces.
I was going to ask you about NATO because the last turnaround with Trump, he wanted to get out of NATO. How would that affect, if God knows if he wants to do it again, how would that affect Ukraine?
Again, I think it's an unlikely scenario, Trump leaving NATO. But if he did, it would obviously weaken NATO, and at least for a certain period of time, really terrify the Europeans, who would have to start spending a significantly larger amount of money on defense. It would cause confusion. It would lower their capacity to resist Russian aggression. It might actually invite a Russian invasion of the Baltic states and Poland. So overall, I mean, the Ukrainians would be able to hold on or hold out for a significant period of time. They've got Europe's strongest army. But that said, it would be a disastrous move, or less so for Ukraine, although obviously it would have negative consequences, but mostly for Europe and NATO in general. My own sense is that Trump is using NATO in order to pressure the Europeans to spend more money in defense. And he's saying things like, if you don't spend 5% of your GDP, we won't defend you in case the Russians invade. Frankly, he's got a point because the Europeans are richer than America. And they're spending, I mean, most of the countries in Europe are spending about 1.5% of their GDP, even though they all agreed a few years ago to be spending 2.5%. And Trump has a point when he says that they're getting a free ride. But it would make no sense for him to leave NATO. It makes a lot of sense for him to blackmail NATO. But to do that, you got to be in NATO.
Would Putin accept ever Ukraine as a sovereign state?
Putin, no. I mean, he may be forced to live with it. So if the US and Ukraine and the West pressure him, he may have to accept the inevitable simply because it's the inevitable, and we're pressuring him to do so. But he himself, in his heart of hearts, will never accept it. He's been so explicit in his rejection of Ukraine and Ukrainians as a separate state and nation.
Yes.
And he's essentially staked his entire career on the war. More than his career, his life, his image, the way he's remembered by history. So for both his personal ideological reasons, as well as for these more tactical political reasons, he just can't suddenly shift gears and say, oh, sure, whatever.
Right.
You know? And besides, if he were to do that, people would start asking, Russians would start asking, so why exactly did we lose 1 million soldiers? To do what?
Yeah, because they're not getting the real story, right? Russia is controlling very much what the Russian people hear on their media.
Exactly. All right. But at some point, you got to figure, with 800,000 casualties, you got to figure that even Russians can see the crippled soldiers on the streets.
Sure.
And then there's inflation, which is beginning to approach hyperinflation. There's a shortage of products. All of these things are things that are beginning to affect Ivan Q. Public.
And if Trump puts these sanctions on top of that, that's really going to hit home for them.
That could be the turning point. Again, it's hard to say, but it certainly could be.
It just interests me that, he was so in love with Putin, and now all of a sudden there's a turnaround. And maybe it's because he realizes that Russia is not as strong and he only deals with people that are going to win. Yeah.
That may very well be it. The question is, how did he learn that Russia isn't strong? Because that was evident 2-3 years ago. So I've been told that he doesn't read. So if that's true, then obviously he either heard it on Fox News, which is unlikely because they are kind of pro-Russian, or someone told him. Who that someone could be, I have no idea.
Well, Alex, this is always a pleasure to get your analysis of this very volatile and changeable situation.
Well, it's always a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us. We'd love to hear from you, so please visit our website at nowletstalkthepodcast.com and send us your comments and questions. We'll see you next time.